Good morning, everyone. My name's Archie Poulos and my family and I are members of Wild Street at 10:30. It's great to be able to speak to all of our congregations and probably to other people as well. Well, welcome to Good Friday 2020. And I'm sure it's one that we will certainly remember because it's unlike anything that we've ever experienced before. And as we journey through everything that's different about Easter this year, I want to ask you, have you ever wondered why this day is called Good Friday? As a child, I asked that question, but now I've got to admit I'm usually too busy to revisit it or to even try and answer it, because the events that we remember today occurred 2,000 years ago, and this day's been called Good Friday for at least 1,600 years. So today, we'll look at one of the accounts of the events that occurred on that Good Friday and explore why it is indeed good, so that you can go away rejoicing, and rejoicing not just today but continually, even in these challenging times. So, Good Friday. Good's a very strange, but it's a very slippery word as well. We use it to mean so many things. Good grief, good heavens, good gracious, good evening, good on you. But we usually attach the word good to things that are somehow pleasant. And even what we consider pleasant, though, that's hard to nail down. Because how do you measure what's pleasant? Something can be pleasant because it makes us feel good at the moment, but later on we feel sick, like lollies and Easter eggs. Some things are pleasant because they will likely lead to a very pleasant result in the future, even if it's painful and hard now. But we're glad about the way that we can persevere through this hardship because we know it's going to get us nearer to a good goal. And so we call the painful experience good. And also, what's good for one person might be bad for another. And how do you weigh those things up? What's good for an individual may not be good for our friends or for our nation. Being placed in isolation may be really, really difficult for the extroverted individual, but it's very good for our loved ones and for our society. There's some of the issues that we need to think about as we try to work out what makes Good Friday good. So in a moment, we're going to hear the events of Good Friday read to us as they were recorded by Luke in chapter 23 of his Gospel. But first, in order to prepare us to listen well, a bit of the story so far and some of the people that are involved in the event so we can listen more carefully. So earlier in the chapter, in chapter 23 of Luke's Gospel, we met the political leaders of Israel. Pilate, he was the governor. He held the power because he governed the nation in the name of Rome, and Rome had occupied this nation. And we also met Herod, who had the title of king, but he didn't have much power except for deciding between the internal Jewish squabbles. And just 5 days before this Good Friday, on the Sunday preceding, we call that Palm Sunday, Jesus rode into Jerusalem, the capital city, on a donkey. And there the masses of people lay their cloaks on the ground to make a path for him, to honour him. And they shouted, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest," just like the angels said at the birth of Jesus. But now, barely 100 hours later, instead of those crowds crying that in Jesus God is glorified and peace has come, another set of voices, the chief priests, the temple officers, the elders, they call for Jesus to be put to death. But they don't have any power on their own to do this, so they bring Jesus to Pilate. And 3 times Pilate declares that Jesus is innocent of any crime. And Pilate passes Jesus on to Herod, and he also finds no reason why Jesus should be killed. And yet Pilate, in order to please this bloodthirsty crowd, agrees to the death of innocent Jesus. This all occurred on the Thursday night before Good Friday, and we pick up the story after dawn on that Friday, that day when Jesus was crucified, nailed to a cross to slowly and painfully die of suffocation. It must have been like drowning ever so slowly, as his ability to lift his body diminished, so that his lungs became increasingly incapable of expanding and so of taking in any breath. As we meet the different people on that day, think about whether the day could in any way be called good for any of them. We will meet Simon of Cyrene. He seems to have been just a bystander caught up in these events. We meet people and women who are mourning what had happened to Jesus and the injustice of it all. We meet two criminals, crucified, one on each side of Jesus. We meet the people who are watching the crucifixion. We see the soldiers who are guarding the place, and a Roman centurion who led the soldiers, who was an unbiased witness to the events that he saw. And there were women who were supporters and followers of Jesus. And finally, us, who are reading the story. So listen to these events and listen for whether anything good occurred for these people, anything that is worth being called Good Friday, as Pauline reads this chapter to us.
Hi, my name's Lara and I'm a member of the AM congregation at Wild Street Anglican Church, and it's my privilege to be reading to you our Bible reading for Good Friday, Luke 23, 26 to 49. That's Luke 23, 26 to 49, and I'll be reading from the English Standard Version. And as they led him away, they seized one Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, and laid on him the cross to carry it behind Jesus. And there followed him a great multitude of the people, and of women who were mourning and lamenting for him. But turning to them, Jesus said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children, for behold, the days are coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" 2 others, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with him. And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And they cast lots to divide his garments. And the people stood by watching. But the rulers scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself, if he is the Christ of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." And he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And he said to him, "Truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." It was now about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And having said this, he breathed his last. Now, when the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God, saying, "Certainly this man was innocent." And all the crowds that had assembled for this spectacle, when they saw what had taken place, returned home, beating their breasts. And all his acquaintances and the women who had followed him from Galilee stood at a distance, watching these things.
Well, did anything good occur on that day? Having heard Pauline read it, I would call it not Good Friday, but Black Friday. Have you ever read or heard more horrible events than this? Talk about kicking a man when he is down. He is painfully gasping for breath, and they are mocking him. And there are the multitude and the women who are weeping and mourning. And even those hardened crowds who perversely gathered to watch the spectacle of death. Look at verse 48 of what is recorded of them. When they saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breasts. That is, they were in anguish and despair and horrified at everything that had happened. And to add to that, the whole of creation groaned in sympathy at this injustice. Verse 44, it was about the 6th hour, that's midday, and there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. What could possibly be good about this Black Friday? There really is no way anyone could spin this to say this was a good day. It was not good for individuals. It was not good for groups. It was not good for society. It was not good for justice. And it was not even good for the creation. This day could only be good if these horrible events finally achieved something much, much better than all the suffering that was involved. But you would need to see the bigger picture to know if that was the case, if that was true. Years ago, there was a TV commercial for an insurance company that no longer exists. It started up with a close-up through the driver's door window, and we saw a young woman who was stopped, waiting for the lights to change. And then the camera panned back a little bit and we saw half the car and we saw the woman's young baby asleep in the car seat. And then, out of nowhere, a big unshaven man appears and starts bashing on the woman's windscreen. And my thought was, this could only be bad. Is he trying to carjack? Is he trying to threaten the woman? Is he trying to take the woman? Is he trying to take the baby? But then as I'm worried, the camera pans back further and we see something that has not been seen before, that no one was aware of. The back of the car is on fire. And instead of the man doing something evil, he's actually striving to save the life of the woman and the child. But you would never know without seeing the bigger picture. So this Black Good Friday could only be good if the bigger picture is good, if the outcome is great. But how is it possible to know that the bigger picture of what the future holds will be good? Well, it's only possible if God is at work to ensure that this good future actually occurs. For God, and God alone, is in control of the bigger picture of what happens. And in the passage that was read to us by Pauline, there are 3 little statements that we're going to look at that show what God is doing and how good it is what God is doing. It shows us what the bigger picture is that God is creating. And they, as we read them, will give us great comfort, great confidence and great relief as we see the bigger picture. Just 3 little verses, verse 34, verse 43 and verse 45. So firstly, verse 34, let's look at the heart of Jesus in verse 34. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And they cast lots for his garments. This is the one whose life expectancy you could count merely in minutes, who is unjustly condemned to death, who gasps for breath while he watches them squabble over his meagre possessions. And what he does is he is not angry, he does not hiss abuse, but he asks God his Father to forgive them the terrible atrocity against him. Though treated horribly, he doesn't hold what they have done against them. He asks God his Father to forgive them. And he asks this of God his Father because it is God who is the judge of the living and the dead. God is the one who weighs up everyone's thoughts, everyone's actions, and justly gives them what they deserve. And here, in almost his last breaths, Jesus asks his Father not for justice, but for forgiveness for people who deserve anything but forgiveness. And the man who was from God, Jesus, who had always been in perfect relationship with God his Father, who had always been given by his Father in heaven everything that he requested, now asks for forgiveness for his enemies, forgiveness for the enemies of God, and forgiveness is granted. How wonderful. But how can anyone be sure that this forgiveness has been granted? Well, look with me at the second little statement in verse 43. He said to one of the criminals, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." Here is a conversation between two men, Jesus and one of the criminals who asked for Jesus to forgive him, to remember him. And you don't have to pan back from seeing this conversation between two people, don't have to pan back very far to see the future, because the future is just sunset when both of these men will be dead. Crucifixion's great power lies not mainly in the pain that it inflicted, though it was a terribly painful way to die. Its great power was that at the end of it, you are stone cold dead. Everything is over. But Jesus' words to this man, "Today you will be with me in paradise." You will not stay stone cold dead. It is not over. It is not hopeless, but life, and a life better than you can possibly imagine. You see, the end of this man's life is not the end. It is just the doorway to something that is so much better. This is forgiveness in action. The man was a criminal. By his own admission, he is being executed for what his deeds deserve. He does not deserve paradise. And nor could he do anything to make himself qualified for paradise. He is hanging there, dying on a cross like Jesus is. Only by being forgiven could paradise be his. And the forgiveness granted by Jesus was all that was necessary for him to enter paradise. Oh, how good it must have been for this man in his agony. Oh, how good to know that. Here is one man at least for whom this was a Good Friday. Even though death awaited him, he could have nothing better to look forward to than what had been granted to him: paradise. But was this good just for one man? What about us? After all, we call it Good Friday as well. What makes this a good day for us? And it's our last little sentence in verse 45. As the earth convulsed at this injustice that was taking place on that day, in recognition not just that an innocent man was dying, but the Son of God was being crucified, as monumental as that was, something even greater occurred. See it there in verse 45? The sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Temple curtain torn in two, not because it was old and worn out, but because it was no longer needed. You see, for centuries, God in his goodness drew close to his chosen people, the Jews, and the place that he chose to draw close to them was a place called the temple. But there was a problem as well. God, who was pure and dwells in unapproachable light, drew near to a people who day after day, every one of them had done wrong. And the purity of God cannot commingle with faults, with the sins of the people that he was drawing near to. And so the temple had a curtain there between God and the people to separate the people from God, so that God would not annihilate them for their sins. And that curtain stood there from the day the temple was built as a symbol that people, while they could draw close to God, still had to remain separated from him. There was still sin that was a problem, and everyone knew what the temple curtain meant. But now, in the death of Jesus, that distance has been removed. God can and does draw even nearer to his people. And the people can come near to God because Jesus' request has been granted. Forgive them. You see, this is not just good news for the criminal, but for anyone and everyone. So do you see why the name Good Friday is probably even too weak a word? It really is Fantastic Friday. There is now access to God because all wrongdoing and sin is forgiven and completely forgiven. There is now access to God because all wrongdoing and sin is completely forgiven for anyone and everyone. Nothing you have ever done can possibly keep you away from God. There is no one who is too far gone who cannot be forgiven. Oh, the immensity of that, isn't it? We all feel hurt from things in days gone by. The bigger the hurt, the harder it is to forgive. Not so here. No matter what you have done, no matter where you have been, no matter how often you have done it, Father, forgive them, is the word, and the word is heard. There is now access to God because all wrongdoing and sin is completely forgiven, not because we've successfully hidden our sins or forgotten our sins, but by the sacrifice of Jesus, of his own life that occurred on this Friday. When we stand before God with everything about us in open view, exposed, Jesus will plead for us before God the Father and Judge, and he will plead his own blood, and the verdict from his Father will be completely forgiven. How good was that for the criminal on Good Friday? How good is that to remember this truth, this Good Friday, that the verdict is the same for us? And in fact, how good is it for us to be able to remember this every day, no matter what the turmoil is that is going on around us? All the criminal had to do was to just ask for forgiveness. And that is the invitation I am putting to you, because God puts it to you. Ask God for forgiveness. Please contact us here at Wild Street to find out more about this wonderful news of Good Friday. God bless you all.